so bear with us now, but I'm sure you'll be engaged. So over to Ian. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I first thank the community group for hosting this event tonight and inviting me here as their guest. Special thanks to Janet, Heidi and Bob for their practical support, and also to Martin. And he has put together a super slideshow of photographs and videos which hopefully will engage you through this talk. I also thank the donors who financially contributed towards the promotion and venue hire. Above all, may I thank each one of you here tonight for attending. For the benefit of those off island, I will from time to time have to explain in simple terms a bit about the Isle of Man, and I'll do that now by saying that the Isle of Man is a crown dependency. In simple terms, that means a semi-independent country with a population of around 84,000. May I begin by saying what this talk is not about. It is not about seeking to discredit all vaccinations or trying to dissuade any person from being vaccinated against COVID-19. If someone gives their true informed consent to any medical treatment, including vaccination, that personal decision ought to be properly respected. Equally, this talk is not about denying the existence of a form of respiratory illness currently circulating in society. Whether you wish to refer to it as COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, or just a form of coronavirus like a common cold or flu, nevertheless, there is a respiratory illness in circulation. And this talk is certainly not about repeating the government narrative that COVID-19 is a potentially lethal virus to us all. Lockdown restrictions are justified and necessary in order to keep people safe, and that everyone should be vaccinated as a matter of public duty. You've heard that narrative every day, of every week, of every month over the last year and a half. But this is not a negative anti-this or anti-that talk. This is a positive talk about choice. This is a talk about introducing some balance into the public debate. It's about putting the counter-argument, and I make no apology whatsoever for doing so. It's about putting the case that lockdown restrictions may not have been and may not now be necessary and proportional. And it's about putting the case that compulsory COVID vaccination may not be lawful and in fact crosses a red line of coercion. I will be referring to some legislation and court cases as we go along, but you'd be glad to hear only in a very light touch way in the hope of making the subject as accessible as possible. So this first part of the talk will be about the lockdown restrictions. When we talk about civil liberties and human rights, what do we mean? Where do they come from? And why do they exist? I picked out some of the main sources of the legal rights that we can currently rely upon as citizens in the Isle of Man and the United Kingdom. If we could have clip 4, please. Might sound a bit nerdy, but this is the Magna Carta. This is a charter of citizens' rights agreed 800 years ago in 1215 at Runnymede in Surrey by King John of England. Now, why I refer to it is because the late Lord Denning, former Master of the Rolls, a senior judge in England, described it as, I quote, the greatest constitutional document of all time, the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. So, the greatest constitutional document of all time in his view. Now that charter was written on parchment made from sheepskin, and we can see there's an example there. There are 4 remaining copies, and it contains 63 rights or clauses. And one of them, I'll just pick out one of them, clause 39, and it reads as follows, translated from the medieval Latin. No free man shall be taken or imprisoned or dispossessed of his freehold or liberties or free customs, or be outlawed or exiled or any otherwise destroyed, nor will we go upon him nor condemn him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or the law of the land. Now that clause in effect became the right to trial by jury, which we enjoy today. Then we come to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's clip 5. Now this was a declaration proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on the 10th of December 1948, so just after the Second World War had ended. And it set out for the very first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected all around the world. The preamble to the declaration includes this. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. But what does inalienable mean? It means cannot be taken away. And then it continues, Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So you were born free and equal in dignity and rights. Then we come to the European Convention on Human Rights. This dates from 1950 and is perhaps the single most important set of legal rights that a citizen can currently rely upon against the state. You've heard that it was incorporated into Manx law under the Human Rights Act 2001. And it makes it unlawful for a public authority to act in a way which is incompatible with a convention right. And if you look at some of the key rights in summarised form, clip 6 please. We'll go through these because these are very important. Article 3, no one shall be subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 6, everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home and his correspondence. Article 9, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Article 10, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. And Article 11, everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association with others. Now, some of these rights are defined, have been defined by the court as being what's called absolute. That's a crucial concept because it means they can never be interfered with in any circumstances. And Article 3 is an example of that. Some of you may recall the case that the Isle of Man does feature as a footnote, shall we say, in human rights case law, the case of Tyra v. the UK. Birching. In 1972 in the Isle of Man, a 15-year-old child called Mr. Tyra was given 3 strokes of the birch on his bare bottom for committing the offence of ABH. The European Court of Human Rights subsequently ruled that birching constituted degrading treatment, contrary to Article 3. So what that means is that whether there's a war, whether there's a national emergency, a health pandemic, there can never be any justification for subjecting citizens to inhuman or degrading treatment. It means what it says on the tin. It means never, it means non-negotiable, and it means never again. Now, interestingly, Article 3 does place the state under what's called a positive obligation to carry out an effective investigation capable of leading to the identification and punishment of those responsible for alleged violations. In contrast, there are other rights which are described as qualified. They can be interfered with, and that includes Article 8, 9, 10 and 11. And they are subject to a test known as proportionality, which means that the interference must be no more than necessary. and states are given a degree of leeway under the doctrine of the margin of appreciation. There's also the Equality Act. If we go to clip 7, please. We'll return to this, but this legislation makes it unlawful to discriminate in employment and the provision of goods and services. In simple terms, it protects individuals from unfair treatment and promotes an inclusive society. There's also the Data Protection Act, which does give important rights regarding confidentiality. And to give an example, businesses and governments simply can't play past the parcel with your private information, and we'll return to both of those later. So that was a taster of some of our important foundational legal rights that we enjoy as citizens. But why does the European Convention on Human Rights exist? Well, it has its roots in the very serious infringements of personal liberty arising during the First World War, the interwar years, and then the atrocities which culminated in the Holocaust. We look firstly at an interesting situation that developed in the Isle of Man during the First World War. Britain was at war with Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. There was a passenger liner, a British passenger liner called the Lusitania, and on the 7th of May 1915, it was sunk by a German submarine. And following that, over 20,000 men, that's German, Austrian, and Turkish men, aged 17 to 55, living in Britain, were rounded up and transported to an internment camp called Knockalo in the village of Patrick on the west coast of the Isle of Man. Here we see an artist's impression of it. 20,000 men were there. They hadn't committed any crime whatsoever. Simply by reason of their nationality, they were forcibly removed from their homes and work in England and placed in wooden huts behind barbed wire in the Isle of Man. One of them was Joseph Pilates, the founder of the Pilates method of physical fitness. Now, there's no suggestion that any of these men were mistreated, but they were forcibly detained for up to 3 years, and some died of natural causes there. And if you go to the churchyard opposite where the camp was, you'll see the graves of 7 Turkish men, Ottoman Muslims, all buried next to each other, separate from the Christian graves. And one of them is called Ramazan Mehmet, who died on the 17th of November 1916. However way you dress it up, this was an early form of concentration camp. We also have the Russian gulags. That was an agency in charge of a network of forced labor camps set up by Lenin and expanded by Stalin and the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 30s. Over 1 million Russian citizens died of hard work, cold and starvation in those detention camps in Siberia. And many were political prisoners detained without trial, simply deemed enemies of the state. Were many thousands of people killed in atrocities and purges in the Spanish Civil War. And one of Pablo Picasso's most famous Cubist paintings is called Guernica, and that was inspired by the bombing of a Basque village called Guernica, where hundreds of women and children were killed on a market day in April 1937. And then, of course, we come to Nazi Germany, and I wanted to consider this in some detail. During the 1930s, the National Socialists, led by Adolf Hitler, rose to power in Germany. Jewish people living in Germany were despicably discriminated against in many ways, such as having to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing, having their businesses vandalized, such as on the infamous Night of Crystal on the 9th of November 1938, when thousands of shop windows were smashed, and being forced to live in designated areas called ghettos. Other sections of German society were also targeted, including communists, homosexuals, and ethnic minorities. After the outbreak of the war in 1939, hundreds of thousands of these citizens were shot on the edge of mass graves or taken to concentration camps. The Nazis established a network of concentration camps across Germany and the occupied territories, where millions of citizens were executed, tortured, and starved to death. That brutality reached its climax at the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. Citizens were transported there in train carriages which were little more than cattle trucks, locked inside for journeys of up to 2 days. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, the people were separated. Women and children, most women and children and elderly, were directed straight away to so-called shower blocks, where they were told to strip naked before entering the facility en masse. In fact, those buildings were gas chambers, cruelly disguised as shower blocks. Once inside, Zyklon B pellets were dropped through a hole in the roof, and the noxious gas emitted killed all those below within a few minutes. The bodies were then taken out and burnt in a crematorium. Meanwhile, the men and women who were not selected for the gas chambers were put to work in service of the Nazi war effort. Many were tortured and treated in the most inhuman and degrading way possible. As you may be aware, some were even subjected to horrifying medical experiments, such as the work of Dr. Joseph Mengele on twin children. A staggering 1.1 million people are believed to have died in the Auschwitz concentration camp. Most of those were Jewish people, but there were also political prisoners, foreigners, and disabled persons. Amazingly, some people survived the experience, and a few are still alive today, with the Auschwitz tattoo still visible on their arms. You could play clip 9, please. Thank you. In total, over 6 million Jewish civilians across German-occupied Europe were murdered during the Second World War. These human beings were exterminated simply because of who they were. They were all deemed unfit to be part of society. The Jews were even labelled spreaders of disease. In effect, their only crime was to be a minority. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear that reference to Auschwitz is made with the greatest of respect and only to help explain how the convention came into being. So, it was in recognition and reaction to such wickedness that immediately after the Second World War, governments around the world came together to establish the United Nations, and then the European Convention on Human Rights followed shortly after. The clear aim was that never again should states be allowed to abuse and mistreat their own citizens. So that is why the convention, how and why the convention exists. A paper international treaty, but written in the innocent blood and tears of millions of Jews, Romani gypsies, Slavs, and infants. So we turn now to the present day and consider the issue of why were lockdown restrictions introduced. They were introduced because the government thought they were necessary. And why? Because after briefly flirting with the concept of herd immunity, the UK government quickly changed tack and accepted the advice of, shall we say, the esteemed Professor Neil Ferguson and his colleagues that it was necessary to limit the spread of the so-called virus by significantly restricting movement and gatherings. A state of emergency, as you will all well know, was proclaimed on the Isle of Man by the Lieutenant Governor on the 16th of March last year, and very soon after a number of regulations were introduced under the Emergency Powers Act 1936. If we go to clip 10, please. And this is the now notorious Prohibition on Movement regulations. Now that, combined with the Prohibition on Gathering regulations, combined to prevent residents from leaving home except for very, very limited circumstances. The Isle of Man and the UK had essentially identical regulations, save whereas that in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, punishment was an on-the-spot fine, usually £100, whereas in the Isle of Man, breach was punishable by a fine of up to £10,000 or, and this is the significant difference, 3 months jail. And we know from a Freedom of Information request that 71 persons received custodial sentences for doing ordinary everyday activities such as staying overnight in a girlfriend's house, and a typical jail term being 28 days. Now, those draconian regulations undoubtedly represented the most severe restrictions on personal freedom in the modern history of the United Kingdom and the Isle of Man. Clearly, a number of human rights articles were engaged. Obviously, Article 8, given the restrictions in terms of being able to leave one's home and visit family and so forth. Victoria's already touched on the cruelty of elderly relatives being left to die and on their own, and being denied family and friends with them in their final hours to hold their hand. I would go as far as saying that our common humanity was brutalised. We also had Article 11. That was clearly engaged because protests, marching and picketing was illegal. It was not deemed a proper reason to be out of your home to go on a protest. We'll come to that in a moment. And you will also be aware of the situation with residents and nationals from the Isle of Man being denied return to the island. There was a period of about 3 weeks during April last year when we appeared to be the only country in the whole world to in effect ban its own residents from returning home. That was the period before the Comus Hotel became a quarantine centre. Article 13 of the United Nations Convention of Human Rights says everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Before considering the issue of whether these various lockdown restrictions were necessary and proportionate, I would briefly like to refer to the role of Parliament and enforcement policy. Because after the state of emergency was declared, unfortunately, the Manx Parliament, Tynwald, ceased to meet in person, and for several months the island was effectively ruled by a handful of ministers and senior civil servants. Far-reaching regulations were passed with Parliament seemingly paralysed by fear, reduced to no more than a rubber stamp. Now, a similar situation has arisen as we speak in the Australian state of New South Wales, where the Premier, Mr Andrews, is currently seeking to introduce a public health bill which would, according to 60 QCs, 60 top lawyers in New South Wales, have signed an open letter opposing the bill because it would leave the government there ruling by decree. So the usual checks and balances on executive power would not be applied to government decisions. So very serious concern, and we saw that last year in the Isle of Man. Equally, in relation to policing, both here in the Isle of Man and the United Kingdom, there were many examples of, shall we say, questionable proportionality. If we could look at clip 11, please. I'm only picking out a few examples for the purposes of this evening's talk, but if you wish to read the full transcript of this, I've included some examples of clients of mine who I represented on the island. You'll see similar examples of, shall we say, the police seeking to enforce by criminal sanction what was mere guidance and their own interpretation rather than what was actual law. Now the important point is this: all of these state-imposed restrictions were based on a premise, namely that the official scientific advice on the necessity of lockdowns was correct and there was no viable alternative. But the truth is that there was a broad spectrum of scientific views on the nature and seriousness of COVID-19 and how it should be dealt with. Because for all the professors on the SAGE team with their doomsday scenarios, there were arguably an equal number of scientists who disagreed and recommended an entirely different approach. For example, there is Doctors for COVID Ethics, and there's also the statement known as the Great Barrington Declaration. We could clip 12, please. This is a statement authored by Professors Gupta, Bhattacharya and Kulldorff, and it derives its name from the town of Great Barrington in Massachusetts, United States, where the declaration was signed last year. And it advocates a very different strategy than the severe lockdowns imposed by this government. This alternative and more proportionate approach would be to shield the elderly and medically vulnerable whilst allowing all other persons to resume their normal lives. No closures of schools, no closures of restaurants, no closures of cafes. Now the declaration specifically refers to the disastrous collateral damage caused by lockdown policies. This declaration has been signed by an impressive 15,091 public health scientists, and when I last looked, 44,501 medical practitioners around the world. Let me say that to you again. 15,091 public health scientists and 44,501 medical practitioners. Can they all be wrong? Now, if we were to create a balance sheet of the good and bad effects of lockdown, what would it look like? And what would the bottom line be? Let's say in the left-hand column, we put the so-called good that's been done, supposedly all the deaths that's been avoided and hospitalizations. But obviously this is pure speculation because different scientific mathematical modelling produces wildly different results. But let's look what would be in the right-hand column. All the bad things that have resulted from lockdown. Here's just a handful. The European Cancer Organization has estimated that over 100 million cancer screening appointments were not performed across 17 European countries since March 2020 as a direct result of lockdown restrictions and delays. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently stated that 950,000 households in the United Kingdom are now in rent arrears. 950,000 households now in arrears. The Isle of Man Treasury Minister estimated that up to April this year, the cost to the Manx purse was in the range 200 and 250 million pounds. And clearly, Victoria's already touched on it, there is a new pandemic, isn't there? And it's this global outbreak of anxiety. And to give just one example of that, if we could go to clip 13, please. Very sadly, the number of suicides in the Isle of Man in 2019 before the pandemic was 6. But last year, tragically, it had increased to 22. So there is this pandemic of fear. It started as a wave of terror spreading through the community. People were afraid of an invisible killer, fearful of being reported to the police for breach of regulations, apprehensive for the future, as if all of life's cards, such as career, holiday and relationships, had suddenly been flung into the air, not knowing where the winds of uncertainty would take them. These fears persist in the minds of many today, creating, to be frank, legions of walking wounded, emotionally scarred for life by completely unfounded anxiety. It's this fear that presents a potentially bigger threat to the nation's well-being than COVID. Consider foreign aid. Because of the economic damage caused by lockdown restrictions, the UK's foreign aid budget has been cut by around £4 billion per year. One example of who will be affected by that, the strategic partnership arrangement with Bangladesh is predicted to result is predicted to result in 360,000 girls no longer being educated because of that cut. So it's fair to say that there have been catastrophic consequences of lockdown. Perhaps someday someone will sit down and prepare a balance sheet, but we should not at all be surprised if the detrimental consequences of lockdown outweigh the good, and that the bottom line will reveal that the indirect damage, cost and harm far outweighed the benefits. In other words, it could be argued that lockdown was a massive self-inflicted wound. Now, in case you're thinking this is a little fanciful, there was a country in the world who didn't impose harsh lockdown, but instead introduced light touch restrictions along the lines advocated in the Great Barrington Declaration. That country is Sweden. I know it's slightly different this year, but the whole of last year, primary schools, secondary schools, cafes, restaurants, shops, all of them remained open. There was government advice and recommendations, but no criminal penalties for non-compliance. The focus was on personal responsibility. And what was the outcome? In Sweden, the death rate with COVID is 1.2%. In the UK, despite 3 lockdowns and many months of closures, the death rate is higher at 1.51%. So we come back to this question about whether these restrictions were necessary and proportionate, or whether they were unnecessary and disproportionate. Now, if you consider the alternative scientific opinion on COVID, consider the example of Sweden, consider the calamitous consequences of lockdown, it may be, and there's some force in the argument, that these restrictions were unnecessary and disproportionate. If that's right, human rights, particularly Article 8 and Article 11, that's the right to respect for private and family life and right to peaceful assembly, were violated and civil wrongs did occur. Because remember, this talk is titled Human Rights and Civil Wrongs. Now, there is some force to this argument if we consider what the legal and political reaction has been. Firstly, in Spain, quite a dramatic decision of the highest court in Spain, the Spanish Constitutional Court, ruled in July this year that the country's first lockdown measures during March to June 2020 were illegal, were unconstitutional and illegal, and that the restrictions had been introduced under a state of emergency, but the Constitutional Court held that the rules were equivalent to a suspension of fundamental freedoms, fundamental rights. Remarkably, the Spanish government is now in the process of repaying €115 million in fines to reimburse citizens who were fined for things such as going out for a walk. €115 million is now being repaid. Consider also the House of Commons. In April this year, the House of Commons Justice Committee on Human Rights surprisingly recommended that all lockdown penalties in England should be reviewed. Now, as at the 20th of June this year, 117,213, so nearly 120,000 fixed penalty notices have been issued. But the Parliamentary Committee described the system as muddled, discriminatory and unfair. And the chairwoman, Harriet Harman, MP, stated that there was a lack of legal clarity, there were concerns about the validity of the fines, inadequacy of the appeal process, and the criminalisation of those who could least afford. So, again, very important decision. House of Commons Justice Committee on Human Rights has said they've recommended that everybody who received an on-the-spot fine for breach of regulations in England All of them should be reviewed. Consider also, shall we say, the court of public opinion, your opinion. Now, as I mentioned, the prohibition of movement regulations effectively ban protests. Under Article 11 of the Convention, there is a right to peaceful protest, peaceful assembly, sorry. Consider the tragic murder of Miss Sarah Everard in London in March this year. Crowds gathered on Clapham Common where she had disappeared. The police subsequently banned a planned vigil on the basis that it would breach COVID rules. There were controversial scenes as male police officers manhandled women when the vigil went ahead, despite a failed High Court action against the ban. Even the Duchess of Cambridge attended the scene to lay flowers. Consider the Black Lives Matter protests. On the 26th of May last year, Mr. George Floyd was murdered during a police arrest in Minneapolis. Protests against police brutality erupted around the world and boiled over in Bristol, where a statue of slave trader Edward Colston was torn down and thrown into the harbour. You can have clip 14, please. See there. So what happens when protests are banned is that eventually public resentment will boil over and sweep officialdom away. Quite frankly, there are a lot more important things in life than observing social distancing. So when you consider the Spanish Constitutional Court decision, the recommendations of the House of Commons Human Rights Committee, there is a valid argument that all historic convictions for breach of COVID regulations ought to be expunged. And there is precedent for this because, interestingly, the Sexual Offences and Obscene Publications Bill in the Isle of Man, that's 2019, will make it possible, as from January, for men convicted of homosexual offences to apply to have their convictions cleared from their criminal records. Homosexuality on the Isle of Man was illegal until 1992. And we know that Alan Turing, the computer scientist who helped Britain during the Second World War, was subsequently prosecuted in 1952 for homosexual acts and, would you believe, chemically castrated, but was later posthumously awarded a pardon under the royal prerogative by the Queen. So equally, there may be political will to review COVID convictions in the Isle of Man. Clearly, these matters that I raise are not of academic or historic interest, because right now, across the world, swingeing restrictions are being reintroduced. In Austria, Ireland, and the Isle of Man, as Vicky's already touched upon, face masks that are mandatory on public transport, not yet in schools, but on public transport. And we know that England moved to Plan B. So if the Isle of Man government is considering introducing severe restrictions, the sincere hope is that important lessons will have been learned about proportionality. Before closing this part of my talk and turning to vaccine mandates, I'd like to mention one further right, which it could be argued has been engaged during the pandemic. It's a little known human right, and it's called the right to truth. The right to truth. Now, this is a somewhat elusive concept, but in simple terms it relates to the right for families of victims of grave violations of human rights to have access to the truth about what happened. For example, the United Nations Human Rights Commission determined in 2016 that there was an inalienable and autonomous right to truth. It was referred to by the European Court of Human Rights in the 2001 case of Cyprus v Turkey, where a number of Greek Cypriots disappeared whilst in the custody of Turkish troops. The UN even has a Right to Truth Day on the 24th of March each year. Arguably, there is great potential for the courts to expand the scope of that right. Now, in this context, there's been many accusations of anti-lockdown and anti-vax protesters using misinformation and disinformation. Let me balance that by referring to clear examples of where state or mainstream media messaging has been wholly unacceptable. Firstly, misinformation. This has been defined as inaccurate or misleading information. For instance, the daily death figures published by the UK and the Isle of Man governments, for many months they were presented as death from COVID. Death from COVID. That definition was subtly amended many months later to deaths with COVID, because of the fact that many persons who died with COVID, in fact, had a number of pre-existing, shall we say, illnesses or injuries, even to the extent that if someone died after getting run over by a bus, having tested positive for COVID in the 4 weeks beforehand, that was recorded as a COVID death, and still is, because the definition of COVID deaths in the UK is death within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And in the Isle of Man, would you believe, it's where COVID is mentioned anywhere on the death certificate. Even more alarmingly, a Freedom of Information response to a Daily Telegraph question revealed that 11,688 people, so over 11,000 people who were recorded as having died from COVID, actually caught the virus whilst in hospital for other reasons. There is no doubt in my mind that the COVID death and hospitalisation figures are misleading and ought to be taken with an enormous pinch of salt. Disinformation. That's false information that is spread deliberately to deceive. The US President Biden recently coined the phrase, pandemic of the unvaccinated. This is a claim, in effect, that hospitalizations and deaths are now overwhelmingly in the unvaccinated. Now, I have heard this term used on the island, but aside from being socially divisive, it is simply untrue. If we look at clip 15, please. This is very revealing. The hospitalization statistics in the Isle of Man show completely the opposite. In fact, 3/4 of patients hospitalized with COVID are double vaccinated. Fully vaccinated, 3/4. So therefore, some would argue the phrase pandemic of the unvaccinated, as far as it's made in relation to the Isle of Man, is a vile lie, being deliberately used to deceive, demonize, and coerce unvaccinated people to get the jab. Consider propaganda. This is false or exaggerated statements spread to help a cause or for an action. In the UK, we've seen the wholesale use of newspaper adverts, Instagram influencers, and so on, pushing the pro-vaccination agenda. The England football manager Gareth Southgate featured in an NHS advert shortly after the Euro football final in June this year, urging everyone to get vaccinated, only to have a think and then backtrack and worry about whether he was, I quote, on the right side of history. This hysteria has recently reached farcical proportions, with Martin Kemp, the former Spandau Ballet and EastEnder member, featuring in a new NHS vaccine promotional video where he plays the part of Father Christmas, getting his booster jab and urging everyone else to get vaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's just been in the garage since January. I mean, it just needs a once-over, to be honest. Any chance you could have a look at it? Lovely. All right, I'll see you Monday.
had, full of inspiring stories and sacrifices people have made. This number goes out to everyone preparing for Christmas.
This winter, vaccinations are the best form of protection to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. So whatever you've got planned, it's not too late to get vaccinated. Check your eligibility now and book your free flu or COVID-19 booster.
Talking about propaganda, I don't know anyone who's travelled on the mountain road recently. The matrix signs, which is supposed to warn of fog or snow, actually says over 45 ? Book your booster. So even road traffic signs have now been requisitioned for the cause. Consider censorship. This is the suppression of ideas and communication. In Silicon Valley in California, the big social media giants such as Google, Twitter, and Instagram, that's where they're based. And I was surprised when I was researching this that Facebook alone employs over 15,000 so-called moderators. These are salaried staff who are paid to view internet content and flag up or remove what they deem to be inappropriate or harmful. So there's a modern day army of censors policing freedom of expression on the internet. To give you one example of this, in September this year, YouTube introduced a blanket policy of blocking all anti-vaccine content. All anti-vaccine content. David Davis MP was caught up in this policy after making a speech at the Conservative Party conference in October in which he argued against COVID passports. YouTube immediately removed the entire speech as contrary to its policy on medical information, although it reviewed its decision following an intervention by the libertarian campaign group Big Brother Watch. But it was a chilling example of how social media firms are seeking to control free speech and has very disturbing echoes of, shall we say, an alarming practice in Nazi Germany. Play clip 16, please. Just pause.
In 1933, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, called the Nazis for short, came to power in Germany and established a dictatorship under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. The Nazis intended to rearm Germany and to reorganize the German state on the principle that the German ethnic group or race was superior to all others in Europe. They suppressed all dissent within Germany, making it a crime to criticize the regime. The newly established Ministry of Propaganda and Enlightenment set up various chambers to control specific aspects of German culture, such as art, literature, theater, film, music, virtually all forms of entertainment and all forms of dissemination of news. In 1933, in April, Nazi German students decided to organize a nationwide book burning program to eliminate foreign influence, to purify German culture as they saw it.
It's leading to this final clip. You see here, books are gathered up, taken out, and thrown on a bonfire. Books by Tolstoy, Oscar Wilde, even the disabled author Helen Keller were flung onto the bonfire. Then we move on to something, you'll take something home tonight. It's a brand new word for you to consider. It's called should information. If we bring that up. Now, this is information which a person already has and which ought to be revealed, but is deliberately not disclosed or published. Let me give you a couple of examples. Firstly, the patient information letter sent out to persons invited to receive the COVID vaccination. This is my one. There's no mention there about the ingredients in the AstraZeneca vaccine, particularly the use of the chimpanzee virus. There's no mention of it being the AstraZeneca vaccine being produced using cloned cells taken from the kidney of an aborted human female fetus. Now, it may be that it wouldn't have made any difference if that had been stated in this. Maybe it would. But the point is, it simply said, if you want to know more about vaccines, look on the internet. There's information available online. There's also the yellow card statistics for adverse reactions and deaths from COVID. They're hidden away in the depths of the UK government website, never openly referred to by mainstream media. Look at clip 20, please.
So we can see here, this is in the UK, so it's not Europe, not America. In the UK alone, nearly 400,000 adverse reactions to COVID vaccines. 400,000 nearly. Has that ever been brought to your attention by Sky or the Daily Mail? Total deaths shortly after vaccination in the UK, 1,814. And that's from the UK government COVID website. So in other words, should information is where transparency is ignored and things not mentioned, which undermine the preferred narrative. This is slightly different from the obligation of public authorities to provide information under the Freedom of Information Act. That is an obligation to take reasonable steps to go out and find information. Should information relates to information the person, body or government already has, but deliberately chooses not to disclose, even though it's in the public interest. So when you consider the combined effect of state misinformation, disinformation, censorship and propaganda, there is a valid argument that Article 9, European Convention on Human Rights, has been engaged. That's freedom of thought. In other words, that the state is playing with your mind. Freedom of thought is one of those rights which has been classed as absolute. There's a difference between freedom of thought and manifesting that thought, but the actual thoughts have been deemed as absolute rights. But I do fear that we are getting perilously close to violating that right. Governments constantly berate citizens to do the right thing, comply with advice, don't be selfish, act responsibility, hammered over the head every day. Now, dissenters from this narrative are made to feel guilty for even daring to contemplate dissenting views. You may recall the character Winston Smith in George Orwell's novel 1984. This is a fictional story of what life would be like in a totalitarian superstate. Thought police persecute individuality, and the central character, Winston Smith, is eventually taken to room 101 and relentlessly brainwashed until he finally accepts 2 + 2 = 5. Some are of the opinion that there are echoes of that in the government's present-day COVID messaging and attempt at mind control. And remember the words of Albert Einstein, Nobel Prize winner, genius. Unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth. Unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth. So there is no need to feel guilty about thinking your own thoughts. In fact, whereas Sajeev Javed, the UK Health Secretary, has said he's on a national mission for everyone to get the booster, well, I'm on a national mission as well, to get everyone to ask why. And there may be a coded message in the turnout figure at the last general election on the island. At the September election, the turnout was only 50.28%. In other words, half of the electorate in the Isle of Man chose not to vote. Perhaps that indicates a disastrous collapse in public trust and confidence in the political class. A big thumbs down to Big Brother State. That concludes this part of the talk, and we will resume again after the break by entering the scary world of compulsory vaccination.